My fault. So I'm just going to welcome Dave Allen, who is many things, but when I see him, I think immediately of the white prominent. But you're not allowed to talk about that.
No, I'm not. Okay, thanks, Jesmond, for the talk about the aberrant moths of the Burren. Paul Waring always referred to butterflies as aberrant moths, so I'm just pinching that one from him. I could have called this Selected Moths of the Burren, moving to the dark side, because anyone who knows me knows that's where I've tended to head in the last 10 years. But anyway, I'll get moving with the talk, just in case you don't realise in the bottom corner there's an Irish annulet, but we'll come back to that in a second. The recordings I don't need to dwell on because Brian's outlined it extremely well. So I'm just going to look more directly at the moths themselves. These figures are approximate because taxonomy changes, and we also have a habit of booting records every now and again, or finding records that we'd overlooked. But in Ireland, in terms of moths, there's about 1,567, 1,600 moth species, and in the Burren, about 970, it's about 60-odd% of all the species of moth occur within the Burren. And if you look at the interesting percentages of micro and macro moths, the percentage of micro moths is higher than the percentage of micro moths. That undoubtedly is incorrect. The micro moths should be higher than that, and that's where some of the gaps are. Not just in adult micro moths, but also in the sadder end of the micro moths, which I'm going to look at in a minute. There's a huge bias in, as Brian's outlined already, in terms of recording in the Burren, and that's just equally true for the moths. A lot to do with recorder expertise. Mothers don't do all moths, or very few of them do. They specialise either in macros or micros. Some people tackle both, but at the same time there are aspects of micro moths which are not tackled by many people. It's a bit of a mess. Leaf miners is where I've gone, and I say that's why I've moved over to the dark side. And leaf miners are looked at by very few people in Ireland. There's a handful of us looking at them. I'm trying to mentor one guy at the moment as well to take up the mantle. It's hard going at times. The big problem as well with the micro moths is the need for dissection and gen det. A lot of species, and the same is true of some of the leaf mines as well, can't be identified without detailed examination, dissection. And at the moment in Ireland, we have one person doing dissection, and that's Ken Bond. There's other people dabbling, but nobody else doing it full time. And that's a nightmare waiting to happen, because basically, at some point, we're going to have nobody doing gen det of micro moths, or macro moths for that matter, which means that we're going to have a load of species which are going to remain unidentified as either-ors, and that either-or could be 20 or 30 species if you're looking at nepticulates. So, bit of a nightmare. It's also effort. Again, Brian outlined this very clearly, in terms of timing, when people come here, why they come here, and where they go. Mothers are like birders. They're very, very driven to see what targets they want to see, and they go to the same sites that everyone else went to over and over again. And there's a real Eastern bias in that in terms of the mothing. Calota's a well-known spot that most mothers would visit Loch Bonny, but the parts of the western fringes hardly ever visited at all. There's also the problem of leaving equipment out. People have had stuff stolen here, generators in particular. So there's the issue of leaving stuff out in certain areas. If you're going to be running a light trap, then it's pretty obvious where your light trap is if someone's driving past in the dark and they think, oh, I wonder what's driving that. Oh, it's a 900 quid generator. And off it goes. So that can happen. English mothers, interestingly, when they come over, they use their method, which is to stay with the trap. They don't They don't leave the traps out, but they would pack up about 3 in the morning and go back to the B&B. And they actually miss quite a few species because some mackerel moths in particular only fly late at night. So there's a bias there even in the trapping. There's also methods. It's not all about light trapping, beating. Many of the old school records are from methods that we no longer use, hardly at all, like sugaring or pupil digging and putting stuff in a box and waiting to see what comes out 6 months later. These sort of things that we just don't do. So a lot of the old records are biased by the techniques used. There's also some issues of access, as again has already been mentioned. Just to give you a very, very brief look, the red is the denser number of records on the macro density per 10 kilometre square. So you can see very clearly there's an eastern bias and a northeastern bias. Same's true of macro records per 10 kilometre square. Discoveries, and again, it's always been a magnet for visiting experts since the late 1940s particularly. These names all are well known to mothers: Pelham Clinton, J.D. Bradley, Maitland Emmett and John Langmaid, and of course Ken Bond. And if you look at some of the things I'm going to look at now in a few minutes, it's basically all these GB, Irish and European experts who find some of these things. Your standard visiting person doesn't see them at all. So there's a huge bias there in terms of the expertise of the recorders. I could have looked at obvious choices like Irish Annulet, Burren Green, 2 well-known specialities. Irish Annulet's distribution there, based on the Moths Island maps, discovered in 1991. Very restricted, and we did a bit of work for Brian which proved how restricted it really is within the Burren region. The Burren Green is, again, Captain Wright discovering it, possibly while going to have a pee over a wall in 1949. We'll never know the truth. Both have extensive European distributions, but are absent from Britain, as Brian said. But I'm not going to look at those species. It's far too easy. So I'm going to look at some of the things that many of you have never heard of. There's loads of discussion species I could have chosen, but just to give a few nice pictures, I thought I'd throw some of them up. Royal Mantle, which is very Burren-centric in Ireland, feeds on bed straws. The dew moth, which, like an algae feeder on the rocks, again, very Burren-centric. Brown scallop has a wider distribution, feeding on rhamnus, as does the dark umber. The tissue, again, found right across Ireland, but the concentration of the tissue, particularly if you start looking for the larvae on rhamnus, is absolutely stunning. The numbers of larvae that you can beat off rhamnus here is just staggering compared with anywhere else. Could have looked at Paracrania chrysolepidella, I always struggle with this one, chrysolepidella, which is one of the eriocranid leaf miners of hazel. Why is that rare? You know, it's not just rare in Ireland, it's rare in Britain. It feeds on hazel. So there's something, again, with the micro chemicals or climate or heat, who knows what, but something very specific going on here, which makes it rare. If you can't see the mine, it's at the bottom of the leaf. It's like the little window in the hazel leaf. Heath rivulet feeds on eyebrights, and again, very Burren-centric. And then Stigmella spinosissima, which is a Burnet rose feeder, coastal distribution mainly in Britain, but in Ireland it's a Burren-centric species again. I haven't got an image of it because there isn't one. It's a leaf mine on Burnet rose, and there are no images online anywhere because it's so uncommon, not just here but in Britain as well. The Moths Island images that are labelled spinosissima I looked at are not spinosissima, they're mislabeled. So unfortunately that's something that needs to change. So difficult. So I'm looking for something which I haven't even got anything other than a written description of, which is really not easy. And then I could have looked at Lease minor, which is a lovely moth, which feeds on Carex flacca. Or I could have looked at Solvagonopteryx capreolella, which feeds on Burnet saxifrage. These are just a sample of some of these species which are Burren-centric in Ireland. But I decided to pick a random selection of other species and just look at their distribution in Britain, their food plants, and it really underpins a lot of what Brian was saying about the strange distributions north and south which come back to the Burren. So, if we look at Mountain Everlasting as a plant, there's an assemblage of species on Mountain Everlasting in the Burren of 3 critical species which all feed on Mountain Everlasting. There's the Irish plume, which doesn't occur in Britain. It's another one of these species which is missed out Britain. It does occur in parts of Europe. In Ireland, it has an interesting distribution away from the Burren. It's in West Fermanagh at Monowilkin, where it was refound this year with about 20 odd individuals by a group from Buckcombe went out with Andy, the moth recorder, and they managed to net quite a few in the daytime at last. Not on the classic Callow Hill site, but another part of the Monowilkin complex. The 3 County Tyrone dots are a bit weird. There is Mountain Everlasting there, but I went and met with the county recorder of BSBI, who took me out to show me the sites, and it's virtually gone from all those sites now as a plant through overgrazing and quarrying. But his family knew Greer, whose those records are responsible, and his father told him that Greer transported the plants with the moth on it to those sites. So the moth wasn't actually resident there. So I think we can say that they're pretty clearly transplanted. So Coleophora papiphorella, again, old records from the Burren and further north, and then again from the same site in Fermanagh, nowhere else. And you think, well, the difficulty with coleophoras is you've got to dissect the adults to get an identification. You can't do many visually. And then finding the cases of them can be an absolute nightmare because they're disguised in with the plant. And that's its distribution in Britain. So it's pretty restricted. Now, is it really restricted, or is it restricted because of the lack of people going to look for it, or even knowing what to look for, or dissecting it if you think you've found it? If you look at the plant distribution, I'll come back to that in a second at the end, sorry. Scrobium valpa morinella is the 3rd species. Again, same distribution, West Fermanagh, and 1 old record from the Burren. Incredibly rare. Scrobi palpa, but again, a highly cryptic species that needs dissection. That's its British distribution. Completely mad. And if you look at the Antenaria distribution, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So there's obviously a lot more going on than just the presence of the food plant or not. Climatic, possibly altitude, but also the need for both the Coleophora and the Scrobi palpa to be dissected to get a proper determination. You can find the leaf mines of the Scrobi palpa, potentially, and you could find the cases of the Coleophora on the flower heads, but believe me, that's a hands and knees job, and not only that, it would probably take days of looking with a chance of turning them up. And again, very little information to go on in terms of even knowing what to specifically look for. I think bare rock and limestone has some link to the presence of the 2 species, which is probably the microchemicals out of the limestone in the plant, and the bare rock, possibly, as Jesmond already said, needed as a heat source, possibly for the species as well. But that's just guesswork. When you see all the research that's been done on a lot of the butterflies, and then you look at the micromoths, there's nothing. So you're really just clinging on, trying to come to grips with what is really happening. So, mountain avens, again, one of the classic plants of the Burren, and there is, as usual, a fairly limited distribution for this plant in Britain. It was more limited than I realised because it's mainly a montane species in Britain, whereas in Ireland, obviously it comes down to virtually sea level on the Burren. There's two sites in Northern Ireland, one up on Benevna and one on the east coast. But it's a very, very montane species throughout the rest of its range. And there is a little nepticulid that leaf mines the leaves of dryas, Stigmella dryadella. And again, you can see here the only records are from the Burren, and all the records are by, all the original records were by one of these famous people who visited J.D. Bradley. There are other records, but this is what you're looking for, and this is the only photographic image I could find of the mine. And these are old leaves, so it's been very, very degraded. Basically, it's a corridor mine around the leaf edge that then turns on itself and creates a small blotch. In older specimens, you can end up with a leaf whitening, but as I found out yesterday looking for this, all the leaves turn white when they get old and die. So you're going, So I spent about an hour yesterday on my hands and knees looking at big patches of dryas without any luck at all. Need to keep looking. Is it under-recorded or is it rare? I couldn't tell you. The adult looks like every other nepticulid, so you're not going to know what it looks like, and it's going to be about 1.8 to 2.2 millimetres, so it's pretty small. Hard to locate, and I think that was prophetic on my half yesterday, but I'm still going to keep looking. Could be in other Irish localities. Bramble is not a species you would think would have specialists on, given the bramble is ubiquitous, but of course bramble is a highly complex plant with highly complex genetics, so I'm not sure how many species of bramble there are, Maria. It's hundreds plus. It's a lot, isn't it? Yeah, so I think that probably has a lot to do with what's going on here. I mean, because we have one incredibly common bramble feeder, which anybody can go out and find anywhere in Ireland, called Stigmella orella. But there are two others in Ireland are known primarily from the Burren. Stigmella oromarginella, which, again, a classic mine, looks very like Stigmella orella, but it should have a sort of amber corridor around the frass line in the mine, and then a nice reddish line outside that. The problem with bramble is anything that damages bramble leaves tends to create reddishness. So you need to be very careful. And basically, to get an identification, there's two mines in this picture, would you believe? You need to get the adult through to gen det, or if you get the larvae, you can identify the larvae to species because there are projections on the larvae of this species as opposed to the other commoner species. The danger with looking for larvae is, and this is what people don't realise looking for leaf miners, is that quite often the leaf miner during the summer may only be in that mine creating all that poo in the little corridor for about 3 to 4 days, and then it's gone. And if you miss that window looking for the larvae, you've missed your opportunity to get an identification, because you need proper, confirmation. You can suspect this is what you have, but you might not be able to prove it. The same is true of this one, Stigmella splendidissimella, which is a thinner line, and John Langmaid, who died this year, there was what's known as Langmaid's rule regarding Splendidissimella and Stigmella orella, which in southern England occur on the same plants in the same areas. If the frass line is thick and broken, very like the picture above in the Aragemella, then it's Stigmella orella. If the frass is thin and largely unbroken, it's an either-or. You can't separate it. So, unfortunately, it's a breed it through job. The good news with Splendidissimella, telling it from Stigmella orella, is you don't need to gen det it. If you can get the adult through, orella as the scientific name would suggest, has a little red tuft on the front of the head and the fronds, whereas Splendidissimella has black. So you can actually tell it just by looking at the adults, if you can get it through. Splendidissimella is almost certainly under-recorded in Ireland. The only records from the Burren are from Maitland Emmett and John Langmaid. No other records. The specimens are in the collection, but they bred them through. So we know they are genuine. But if we look at the maps, the top one, Aragimella, is only known old records from the Burren, nothing more recent, and you can see how rare it is in Britain, southwest England only. And then Splendidissimella, which again we only have confirmed records from the Burren, from Langmaid and Emmett in the 70s. But look at the distribution in England. We must be overlooking that species. But it means breeding it through. And this is something I do intend to do with mines, I suspect. Scarce Crimson and Gold, thought I'd put a pretty one up rather than looking at little blotches on leaves. Very interesting species. It's common on the Burren, rare in the east and the north. It's very restricted in the north to the dune systems in North Derry and dune systems in the east. There's one record up from Sligo. So it's extinct in Britain. It's a colony on the north end of the Isle of Man. And as was written in the 1910s, and in one bit of literature, it says this Parusta sanguinalis was extirpated by golf. And that's exactly what happened. Some of its prime sites were all turned into golf courses. But elsewhere away from the Burren, it's a dune colony. It's dune species. Dune colonies is where you find it. Limestone karst in the Burren, which is absolutely akin to where you would find it on continental Europe, where it lives on karst. So it's easier to understand its distribution. Few conundrums. So presence of food plant not the only factor. Some species occupy niches more akin to continental Europe rather than Britain, again as outlined by Brian. Some have montane distributions, like the Lease minor has a limestone distribution. Some buckthorn feeders reflective of host plant distribution in Ireland, like dark umber and Stigmella catharticella at the top there. Bucculitix frangitella at the bottom, one I hope to find in the next day or so, has a very restricted distribution, Burren-centric. But looking at the GB maps, you would expect they should be wider distributed. So conclusions, there's more needed. A lot more work needed on the cryptic and mining species to find out their true Irish distributions. It's unclear, as Brian said, you could come up with all kinds of mad theories, but these things fly. So that might be as simple an explanation of how they all ended up here. For every theory you come up with is always an exception, which is, someone once said, the study of moths is the study of exceptions, and I think that's pretty true. A lot more to discover. I'm just going to throw final conundrum. They are out there, or are they? This is photos, and I saw the specimens, there were two, but the backstory to these records was very unconvincing, one would have to say. But nevertheless, they were specimens and there were photos, and I know the photos were taken on the Burren, and I know the photos were taken with the camera of the person who claimed the records, because I checked the EXIF data. In GB, it's an immigrant with a very small remnant population on coastal shingle. So you'd think, what the hell's that got to do with the Burren? Well, in Europe, the same species occupies karst habitats, just like many of the other Burren specialities, like Parusta sanguinalis. Some of you may have guessed it, I doubt it, but it's the bright wave. Now, they were claimed, two specimens claimed in 2006 from near Dromore Wood. And I know that moth was photographed that's on the right there, was photographed at Dromore Wood. How it got there is the big question. The records are not in the database, but it just shows what might be out there. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dave. Time for one question, I think, for coffee. Okay, Connor got his hand up first.
Just kind of for monitoring moths in general, either getting into stuff in that aspect, is it what kind of methodology is best to kind of look for the host plant and look for the larval stages, or the nighttime surveys to like the UV traps and stuff to catch the adults? What's kind of the best way to break in and get better practice on all those kind of aspects?
Well, it's a very good question is the first point, because the problem with light trapping is, with light trapping, what you're sampling is what flies past the light. It doesn't necessarily mean it's breeding in the site where you're trapping. And that's a huge problem. Lots of academic institutions have done lots of nice, easy projects with students, light trapping in gardens to show what's there. It doesn't show what's there, it shows what's flying past the light, which is a fundamental problem with using light traps for that kind of research. You need to look at the larvae, the food plants, and if you want to find out what's breeding in an area, then that's the only way you can go. You've got to try and tie in what you're looking at with what it is you want to. If you just want to see moths, run a light trap. But if you want to tie it to the management of a site, then you need to do much more detailed look at what's actually on the food plants, looking at the larvae, looking at the leaf mites, and finding out what your fauna, moth fauna is of the area that you're studying. Using the light trap is a great thing to do, great fun thing, but it doesn't tell you what's there. Otherwise, we wouldn't catch completely mad things in Eamon's garden in Dublin, or my garden in Belfast, or Clive's garden, which is a concrete patio in Belfast, with a huge list of species, including red list species in his garden. But they're not there, they're just flying past the light. So.